The world wasn't supposed to end like this. Jacob never imagined that the quiet town where he had lived all his life would become a wasteland haunted by the relentless moans of the undead. But as the first rays of dawn pierced the smoke-filled sky, he knew that everything familiar was gone. Jacob awoke with a start, the heavy silence of his home broken only by the distant, chilling groans outside. He sat up in his bed, heart pounding, sweat soaking his shirt. His small apartment, once a haven of normalcy, now felt like a fragile island in a sea of chaos. For days, news had trickled through the cracked radio speaker, reports of a deadly virus spreading faster than anyone could comprehend, turning people into mindless creatures hungry for flesh. The government's attempts to contain the outbreak had failed spectacularly. Cities fell one by one, governments collapsed, and the survivors were left to fend for themselves. Jacob remembered the moment it all changed. He was at the grocery store when the first wave hit, people screaming, running, and then the horrifying transformation began. Friends, neighbors, strangers turned into monsters with glowing eyes and gnashing teeth. The store became a battlefield. Jacob barely escaped with his life, clutching a crowbar he had grabbed off a shelf. Now, as he looked out his window, the streets were crawling with the undead. Shadows moved with jerky, unnatural motions. The familiar faces he once smiled at were now twisted and monstrous. But he was alive, for now. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood, though no one dared to venture out to clean or help. Jacob's mind raced with questions. How long could he survive alone? Was there anyone left out there who hadn't turned? And most importantly, could he find a way to rebuild something worth living for? He had seen the worst of humanity in those first terrifying hours. Desperate survivors who attacked each other for food, townsfolk who barricaded themselves inside only to perish in silence, and worse, betrayal from people he had once called friends. But Jacob refused to let despair win. He packed a small bag with the essentials, a flashlight, a few cans of food, a water bottle, and his crowbar. He had scavenged a map from the store, marking safe spots he'd overheard on the radio. His plan was simple but dangerous: find a secure place to hide, gather supplies, and then, somehow, find others who might want to rebuild what was lost. Before leaving, Jacob took a moment to stand in his empty living room, looking around at the faded photographs on the walls, reminders of a life that felt like a distant dream. His family was gone. Friends, gone. But maybe, just maybe, a new beginning was still possible. He slid his jacket over his shoulders, stepped out the door, and locked it behind him. The world outside was silent, save for the distant shuffle of the undead. His first challenge was the old library, a sturdy building just a few blocks away. It was rumored to have a basement that could be barricaded, and maybe, just maybe, some supplies left untouched. The journey would be treacherous, the streets were a maze of abandoned cars, overturned bins, and the ever-present threat of zombies lurking in every shadow. Jacob moved cautiously, every sound amplified in his ears. He held his breath as a figure stumbled around the corner, but it was just a stray dog, skittish and thin. For a moment, Jacob felt a flicker of hope. Life, even in the apocalypse, found a way. But then, the groans grew louder, closer. Jacob's heart pounded as he sprinted the last few yards to the library's back entrance. He slammed the door shut behind him and barricaded it with a heavy shelf. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, but it was quiet. Too quiet. Jacob pulled out his flashlight and shone it around. Rows of books stood silent, their stories frozen in time. He moved to the basement stairs, his hands trembling as he descended into the darkness. The basement was cramped but solid. He quickly stacked old tables and chairs against the door, creating a makeshift fortress. Then, he searched for anything useful: canned food, water, first aid supplies. Hours passed as he worked, the outside world feeling miles away. The groans and banging on the door told him the undead were still out there, waiting. But inside this small shelter, Jacob had a moment of peace. He lit a candle and sat down against the wall, exhausted but alive. As he closed his eyes for a moment, the reality hit him: this was just the beginning. The fight for survival was only starting, and the road to rebuilding would be long and perilous. But Jacob was determined. Somewhere out there, others might be struggling too. And maybe, just maybe, together they could start anew. His journey wasn't over. It was just the first step toward a new beginning in a broken world. The candle's faint glow flickered as Jacob sat in the basement, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Outside, the relentless moans of the undead drifted like a dark melody through the walls, a reminder that safety was only an illusion. But inside this cramped room beneath the old library, Jacob allowed himself a rare moment of calm. He pulled out the tattered map he had found in the grocery store. Faint lines and marks showed pockets of survivors rumored to be scattered across the state. Some were said to be holed up in fortified buildings, others roaming in small groups, all struggling, all desperate for hope. Jacob's plan was clear: survive long enough to find those people and build something real. But how could he trust strangers in a world where betrayal lurked in every shadow? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from above, a scraping, a soft thud. Jacob froze, gripping his crowbar tightly. Someone was trying to get in. "Hello," a voice whispered urgently. Jacob's heart pounded. He whispered back, "Who's there? Are you alone?" A figure slipped through the hatch, a young woman, her clothes torn but her eyes sharp and wary. She carried a backpack and a small handgun, a symbol of how brutal this new world had become. "My name's Sarah," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been on the move for days. I saw your door barricaded. Thought maybe, help?" Jacob studied her carefully. Trust was a dangerous gamble now. But she looked exhausted and sincere, and desperate, like him. "Come in," Jacob said finally, stepping aside. Sarah dropped her pack with a sigh of relief. "I didn't know if anyone was left." "Me neither," Jacob replied. "But maybe we can change that." The two survivors sat down on the cold floor, sharing their stories between whispered breaths. Sarah had been a nurse before the outbreak, one of the first to treat patients when the virus hit. She told Jacob about the hospitals overwhelmed, the military quarantine zones falling apart, and the desperate scramble to find safety. Jacob shared his own tale: the grocery store massacre, his frantic escape, the loss of everything he loved. For a moment, the basement felt less lonely. "We can't stay here forever," Sarah said. "The undead won't give up. And supplies won't last." Jacob nodded. "I'm planning to move to a more secure location, an old factory on the edge of town. It's fortified and has water access. But I'll need help." Sarah's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You're lucky I found you. I know others. Small groups that still fight back. Maybe we can join forces." Hope flickered. But the night was far from safe. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above. The library door shook violently as something, or someone, pounded on it. "Zombies," Jacob said grimly. "They're trying to get in." Sarah grabbed her gun, but Jacob held up a hand. "Not yet. They're just trying to break through. We have to wait." Minutes stretched into hours. The pounding grew more frantic, then slowly faded. Jacob and Sarah exchanged a tense glance. The undead were relentless, but so were the survivors. "We should rest," Sarah suggested. "We'll need our strength for what's ahead." Jacob nodded, but sleep didn't come easy. His mind raced with questions. Who else was out there? Could they really find others willing to fight? Was rebuilding even possible in this nightmare? As dawn broke, Jacob stepped outside cautiously. The streets were eerily quiet, the once bustling town reduced to ruins. Broken windows, overturned cars, abandoned belongings, the ghostly remnants of a life erased. He looked up at the gray sky and made a silent vow. No matter what happened, he would fight to survive. Not just for himself, but for anyone still clinging to hope. The journey was just beginning. Jacob and Sarah moved cautiously through the empty streets, their senses sharpened by the ever-present danger. The sun was rising, casting pale light over a town transformed into a graveyard. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant sound a threat. Their destination was the old factory on the town's outskirts, a place Jacob had scouted before. It was a massive, concrete structure, once used for manufacturing, now abandoned but solid. The perfect shelter, if they could reach it. Jacob led the way, crowbar in hand, while Sarah kept her pistol ready. They communicated in whispered tones, alert to every scrap of movement around them. As they approached, the factory loomed like a fortress. Broken windows and rusted gates gave it a grim appearance, but inside, it promised safety. Jacob checked the perimeter carefully. He knew the dangers weren't just the undead, desperate survivors could be equally ruthless. "We're not alone," Sarah said softly, nodding toward a flicker of movement near a distant warehouse. Jacob's grip tightened. "Keep your guard up." They slipped around the side and found a service entrance that was surprisingly intact. Jacob worked quickly to pry it open, the metal groaning but yielding. They slipped inside, breathing in the stale air. The factory's vast interior was filled with machinery long silent, shadows stretching across the concrete floor. It was cold and empty, but it was shelter. Jacob and Sarah moved to secure the entrances, stacking crates and debris to block access. Every noise outside made their hearts race, the groans of zombies, the distant clang of metal, the eerie quiet of empty streets. They found a small office space with a locked door and windows that could be barricaded. It would be their command center, a place to regroup. As Sarah inspected their supplies, a handful of canned food, a few bottles of water, some medical kits, Jacob studied the map again. "We need more than just this place," he said. "We need a community. People who can help rebuild." Sarah nodded. "I know a group outside town, a small band of survivors. They've been trying to organize, find safe zones, share resources." Jacob hesitated. "We don't know if they'll trust us." "Trust is earned," Sarah said with a faint smile. "But we have to try." Just then, a faint noise echoed from deeper inside the factory, footsteps. Jacob motioned for silence, gripping his crowbar. Sarah raised her gun. A figure stepped into the dim light, a tall man with a weathered face and weary eyes. He held up his hands slowly. "I'm Michael," he said quietly. "I've been living here with a few others. We heard you outside." Jacob relaxed slightly. "We're looking for people. A community." Michael nodded. "There's more of us. Not many, but enough to start something. We've been fortified here for weeks." The tension in the room eased a bit. It was the first sign that rebuilding might be possible. But then, from outside the factory walls, came a sudden, bone-chilling sound, a scream followed by a rush of shuffling feet. "Zombies!" Michael cursed and grabbed a metal pipe. "They're breaking through the outer fence. We have to hold them back." Jacob, Sarah, and Michael quickly prepared to defend their stronghold. They barricaded doors, grabbed weapons, anything that could be used to fight. The first wave crashed against the factory like a tide of death. The undead clawed and screamed, trying to break through. Inside, the survivors fought fiercely. Jacob swung his crowbar with desperate strength, each blow buying precious seconds. Sarah fired her pistol, aiming carefully to conserve bullets. Michael swung the pipe, blocking a zombie's advance. The battle was brutal but brief. The undead eventually retreated, but the message was clear: the fight for survival was far from over. Breathing hard, Jacob looked around at the small group of survivors. "We can't keep fighting like this," he said. "We need a plan." Michael nodded. "We'll need better weapons, more supplies, and a way to communicate with others." Sarah added, "And we have to find out how this started, if there's any way to stop it." Jacob's mind raced. The journey ahead was dangerous, filled with threats from both the living and the dead. But in that moment, surrounded by people willing to fight, he felt a spark of hope. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the beginning of something new. A new beginning in the apocalypse. The factory's dim interior had become a fragile sanctuary. Days blurred into nights as Jacob, Sarah, Michael, and the few others who joined them settled into a rough routine, fortifying defenses, scavenging nearby ruins, and sharing stories of a world that no longer existed. But the scars of the past clung tightly. No one spoke openly about the moments before the collapse, but each carried memories that haunted their dreams. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob sat near a flickering lantern, studying a battered notebook he'd found tucked inside the factory office. The pages were filled with hurried notes, sketches of strange symptoms, and hastily drawn maps. This was someone's journal, Jacob said quietly, showing the others. Looks like it belonged to a scientist or a doctor. It talks about a virus, something that spread faster than anyone expected. Sarah leaned in, her nurse's instincts kicking in. Symptoms, transmission, it matches what we've seen out there. Michael frowned. Why didn't we hear about this? The government? The media? Jacob shook his head. Chaos. Fear. Probably attempts to cover it up or control panic. But now, all we have is this. The group fell silent, the weight of truth sinking in. The apocalypse wasn't just random, it had a cause, a beginning that few understood. That night, sleep was elusive. Jacob's mind churned with questions. Could there be a cure? Was there hope beyond survival? But answers were hard to come by. The next morning, the fragile peace shattered. A scout returned breathless with news. A rival group was approaching, armed and hostile, intent on taking the factory by force. The reality hit hard. In a world overrun by the undead, the deadliest threats often came from the living. Jacob gathered the survivors. We can't let them take this place. It's more than just a shelter, it's our chance to rebuild. Sarah loaded her pistol, determination in her eyes. We'll fight. Together. Michael nodded grimly. We need a strategy. Over the next hours, the group prepared. Barricades reinforced, traps set, weapons distributed. As the sun dipped again, the rival group arrived, shadowy figures moving with purpose through the ruins. The battle was brutal and chaotic. The two groups clashed in the factory's narrow corridors, echoes of shouts and clashes ringing out. Jacob fought with fierce resolve, protecting Sarah when a stranger lunged at her. Michael and others covered the rear, fending off attackers. Amidst the fight, a shocking revelation, one of the rival group's leaders was a former government official, someone who knew more about the virus than anyone had admitted. In a tense confrontation, Jacob demanded answers. The official revealed that the virus had been the result of failed experiments, attempts to weaponize a pathogen gone horribly wrong. The truth was a bitter pill, but it strengthened their resolve. The rival group's aggression faltered, realizing that cooperation was their only chance. By dawn, an uneasy truce was formed. Both groups agreed to combine forces, pooling knowledge and resources. Jacob stood on the factory's roof, looking out at the broken world below. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But in the hearts of the survivors, a fragile hope was growing. They weren't just fighting to live. They were fighting to rebuild. A new beginning in the apocalypse. The uneasy truce between the two survivor groups brought a fragile sense of hope, but trust was a currency hard-earned in a world shattered by chaos. The factory, once a fortress against the undead, was now a bustling hub of cautious cooperation. Jacob, Sarah, Michael, and their new allies worked side by side, pooling knowledge and resources with one shared goal: survival, and eventually, rebuilding. Jacob moved among the survivors, sensing the underlying tension. The former government official, Robert, kept to himself, a shadowy figure haunted by the secrets he carried. Yet his knowledge about the virus and its origins made him invaluable. Every evening, he sat with Sarah and Michael, poring over the torn pages of journals and maps, searching for clues. We need more than just shelter and weapons, Robert said one night, his voice low and urgent. We need communication. If other survivor groups are out there, they have to know where we are, that we're trying to build something better. Jacob nodded, understanding the importance. The old radio equipment they found in the factory was battered but potentially usable. Repairing it became a top priority. Days turned into weeks as they fortified the factory further, organizing patrols and rationing supplies. Yet the undead remained a constant threat, sometimes a distraction from the dangers closer to home. Jacob's suspicions about human threats weren't unfounded. Whispers spread of scavengers lurking in the nearby woods, bandits who preyed on weaker groups, stealing food and weapons. The survivors knew it was only a matter of time before a confrontation. One afternoon, during a supply run to a nearby abandoned supermarket, Jacob's team encountered evidence of the bandits, broken crates, makeshift camps, and signs of recent activity. Sarah's face hardened. "They'll come here eventually." Jacob clenched his jaw. "We'll be ready." Back at the factory, the atmosphere grew tense. Everyone was on edge, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. But amid the fear, small moments of normalcy emerged. Children laughed quietly in hidden corners, meals were shared, and stories told around flickering fires. Jacob found himself drawn closer to Sarah, their shared hardships forging a bond beyond survival. Yet even as hope grew, so did the shadows. One night, a terrible discovery shook the group: a survivor was missing. His belongings scattered, bloodstains trailing to the factory gates. It was clear he'd been taken, or worse. Jacob gathered the group. "We don't know who did this. Could be the bandits. Could be the undead. But we need to find him." Michael volunteered to lead a search party. Sarah and Jacob insisted on going as well. The search was perilous. The forest was thick with dangers, rotting corpses lurking in shadows, traps left by hostile humans, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. After hours of searching, they found the missing man, wounded but alive, in an old hunting cabin. He had been attacked but managed to escape his captors. His story was chilling. The bandits were more organized than anyone realized, heavily armed, and growing bolder. Jacob realized the threat was no longer just survival against the undead. It was a battle for the future, for safety, trust, and the chance to rebuild. Back at the factory, Jacob, Sarah, Michael, and Robert convened. "We need allies," Robert said firmly. "And stronger defenses." Jacob's mind raced with possibilities. They could send messages on the radio, try to contact distant survivors. Maybe form a coalition, a network of safe zones connected by trust and cooperation. But first, they had to survive the coming storm. The bandits were coming. And the fight for their new beginning was about to become even more dangerous. The factory's heavy gates creaked ominously under the weight of dusk as the survivors prepared for what they all feared: the bandits' assault. The uneasy peace shattered like glass, replaced by a tense stillness that hung over the factory grounds like a storm cloud ready to burst. Jacob stood atop the factory roof, scanning the horizon as twilight deepened. Sarah joined him, her eyes sharp beneath the hood of her jacket, her pistol holstered but ready. "They'll come at night," she said quietly. "Less chance of being seen." Jacob nodded. "We've fortified every entrance. Traps are set. But they're organized, they won't just rush in blindly." Below, survivors moved with purpose. Some sharpened makeshift weapons, others reinforced barricades. Children were ushered into safer rooms, away from windows and doors. The factory that had once been a refuge now felt more like a fortress under siege. Michael checked the ammo supplies, his face grim. "We don't have enough bullets for a long fight." Robert, normally quiet and withdrawn, stepped forward with a plan. "We can use noise and light as distractions, flare guns, banging on metal, to mislead them and buy us time." Jacob agreed. "We have to stay united. No one fights alone tonight." As darkness fell, the factory seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the woods came the first sounds: distant footsteps, hushed voices, and the soft clinking of weapons. The bandits were here. The survivors took their positions, hearts pounding in rhythm with the night. Suddenly, a flare shot up, casting an eerie red glow over the trees. Shadows danced as the bandits advanced cautiously, searching for a weak point. Jacob's group responded with a hail of noise, banging on metal sheets, shouting from different directions, confusing the attackers and drawing them into traps. A sudden crash echoed as a trapdoor gave way, sending a bandit tumbling into a pit filled with sharpened stakes. But the fight was far from over. Gunshots rang out, splintering wood and metal. Sarah fired with steady precision, taking down one attacker after another. Jacob swung his crowbar, close and brutal, while Michael's pipe cracked bone with every strike. The bandits, frustrated and angered by the resistance, intensified their assault. Some tried to scale the walls, others attempted to force gates open. Inside, fear mixed with fierce determination. One moment, Jacob saw a bandit slip past the barricade near the storage room. He lunged, catching the intruder off guard, and the two crashed to the ground in a desperate struggle. Outside, the undead lurked on the edges, drawn by the noise and chaos, their moans adding a terrifying soundtrack to the battle. Jacob's breath came in sharp gasps. He knew they couldn't afford to fight on two fronts, the undead and the bandits, but tonight, they had no choice. Hours passed in a blur of adrenaline and pain. Several survivors were wounded, and supplies dwindled faster than expected. At dawn, the bandits finally retreated, dragging their dead and wounded with them. The factory was battered but still standing. Jacob looked at the exhausted faces around him. They had survived the night, but the cost was heavy. "We won this battle," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "But the war isn't over." Sarah wiped blood from her brow. "We need better weapons, more allies, and stronger defenses." Robert nodded. "And we need to know what's out there, beyond this town." Michael added, "If we want a future, we have to stop just surviving and start fighting smart." Jacob agreed. The siege had changed everything. Survival was no longer enough, rebuilding meant facing threats head-on and preparing for whatever came next. As the survivors tended to their wounds and repaired the damage, Jacob's thoughts turned to the radio equipment Robert had mentioned. It was time to reach out, to find others like them, to build a real community. The sun rose over the factory, lighting the ruins of the world they had lost. But within those ruins, a new beginning was taking shape. The morning after the siege was quiet, almost surreal. The survivors moved carefully through the battered factory, tending to wounds, salvaging what remained, and repairing the barricades. The night's battle had tested their limits, physically and emotionally, but it had also forged something stronger among them, unity. Jacob, Sarah, Michael, and Robert gathered near the radio room, a cramped space filled with tangled wires, dusty dials, and a handful of fragile components. The old radio set was battered, but not beyond hope. Robert's fingers worked deftly, adjusting knobs and connecting wires as he explained, "We need to boost the signal. If other survivors are out there, they have to hear us." Jacob watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "And if no one's listening? We won't know unless we try." The group spent the day repairing the radio, scavenging batteries from nearby ruins and jury-rigging antennas from scrap metal. As night fell, the factory was once again cloaked in darkness. The survivors gathered around the radio, tension thick in the air. Robert flipped the switch, and static crackled through the speakers. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Jacob Reed, calling from the abandoned factory on the east edge of town. We are survivors seeking others. If you can hear this, respond." Minutes passed with nothing but the hiss of static. Just as hope began to fade, a crackling voice broke through. "This is Delta Base, survivors here. Coordinates sent. We're low on supplies. Need help." Cheers erupted among the survivors. It wasn't much, but it was proof they weren't alone. Jacob's heart swelled with determination. "We have to find them." But the radio message also brought new questions. Who were Delta Base? How far were they? And how many others like them existed? In the days that followed, Jacob's group fortified the factory further, using the promise of connection as motivation. Scouts were sent out to explore surrounding areas, mapping potential routes and identifying threats. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Not everyone trusted the strangers who had joined them after the siege, and some questioned the wisdom of reaching out to unknown groups. One evening, a heated argument broke out near the workshop. "We can't trust anyone," a survivor named Lisa insisted. "People are desperate. They'll turn on us the moment it suits them." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "Trust is risky, but it's also the only way forward. We can't survive as isolated pockets forever." Jacob intervened. "We'll be cautious. But we have to try." The group eventually agreed to proceed, though warily. Then came a new challenge. The radio crackled with urgent warnings. A massive horde was moving toward the town, drawn by the noise of the recent battle. Panic threatened to take hold, but Jacob's leadership kept the group focused. "We prepare. We don't run," he declared. "This is our home now." As the survivors readied themselves for the coming storm, Jacob's thoughts turned inward. The journey to rebuild was no longer just about survival, it was about hope, trust, and the courage to face an uncertain future. The night sky darkened with the shadows of the undead, but the factory's lights burned bright, a beacon of defiance in a broken world. "Let me know when you want Part 8, the finale." "You said 8. ChatGPT said. "Here's Part 8, the finale, of A New Beginning in the Apocalypse, One Survivor's Journey to Rebuild, 795 words, wrapping up the story with suspense, resolution, and hope. Part 8, Dawn of a New Era, Facing the Future Together." The first signs of the horde were barely visible through the early morning fog, shambling figures, slow and relentless, moving like a living tide toward the factory walls. Jacob stood shoulder to shoulder with Sarah, Michael, and the others as the survivors braced themselves for the most critical fight of their lives. The siege last week had tested their limits, but this time, the stakes were higher. The horde was larger, drawn by the noise and activity within the factory. It was as if the world itself wanted to crush the fragile spark of hope they had ignited. Jacob's heart pounded, but his mind was sharp. He glanced at the makeshift barricades, the lookout posts, and the fortified gates. Every scrap of effort, every sleepless night, had led to this moment. "Stay calm, stay focused," he instructed firmly. "Don't waste ammo on wandering walkers. Conserve your strength for the real threats." Sarah tightened her grip on her rifle. "We can do this." As the sun rose, the horde grew louder. The survivors took their positions, eyes burning with determination. Children were secured in safe rooms, their whispered prayers carried on the morning breeze. Then, the attack began. The undead surged forward, pounding the gates with brute force. The factory trembled under the assault, but the barricades held. The survivors fought with every ounce of courage they had, their shouts and gunfire echoing through the ruins. But amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. A group of figures appeared on the far ridge, armed, moving quickly, and coordinated. It was Delta Base. Their arrival brought a surge of relief and renewed strength. With fresh allies joining the defense, the survivors launched a counterattack. Together, they pushed the horde back, reclaiming lost ground with brutal efficiency. The battle raged for hours. Sweat, dust, and fatigue weighed heavy, but the survivors refused to yield. When the last undead collapsed, silence fell like a fragile veil. Jacob looked around at the battered but victorious group. Faces were smeared with dirt and tears, but eyes shone with fierce hope. Delta Base's leader approached. "We heard your call and came as fast as we could. Together, we can rebuild. Not just survive." Jacob nodded. "We've started something here. A new beginning." In the days that followed, the survivors and their new allies worked side by side, clearing ruins, planting crops, and securing communication lines. The factory transformed from a fortress into a community, a beacon of resilience in a broken world. Jacob stood on the rooftop one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah joined him, the weight of what they'd endured balanced by the promise of what lay ahead. "We're not just survivors," she said softly. "We're builders. Dreamers. Fighters." Jacob smiled. "A new beginning. That's what this is." As stars emerged overhead, the factory's lights twinkled, symbols of hope, unity, and the unyielding spirit of humanity. The apocalypse had taken much, but it had not taken everything. Together, they would reclaim the world, one day, one fight, one new beginning at a time. That's the complete 8-part outline with detailed, engaging, and suspenseful parts suitable for your zombie audiobook series. If you want, I can help you expand or modify any part.